Hello, my name is Jeff Becker. I'm with the Tepper School of Business. Today I'm talking with Dr. Ajit Shetty, Chairman of the Board of Directors and Managing Director of Janssen Pharmaceutica. Welcome, Dr. Shetty.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Let's get started, if we may. Before I do, let me say Ajit is a 1976 graduate of the Tepper School of Business. Ajit, in my lifetime, pharmaceuticals have completely transformed our expectation of a quality of life. If you were to look at a single set of critical issues facing Janssen or facing industry, what would they be as you look forward?
Let me start off with basically two facts. The first fact is that this is a manufactured product industry as opposed to a service industry. Sure, there's a lot of information we give with the product. And the second is it's predicated on a patent system. So patents for new discoveries. So if you look at that, those two facts, I think the single most critical element for us is the development and launching of new products, improve new products to improve the quality of life in different disease segments. Let me just roll the clock back to the Second World War. Life expectancy those days for the average male was somewhere in the region of 50, 55 years. Today we are talking about life expectancies of about 80 years. All that tremendous progress that's been made is to a very large extent being helped by the pharmaceutical drug industry as we've developed medications to combat certain diseases that cause death in that age segment. So what is the single most critical element? Is the development of new products and the launching of new products. The day the product goes off patent, there are companies like here in Pittsburgh, Mylan, etc., who will copy it at a very low cost, a fragment of the cost of the product, and it becomes available, and there's very little profit left in the selling of those drugs. So it's got to be, it's the fuel, it's the engine that fuels the growth of the pharmaceutical companies like Janssen and others.
I'm glad you brought up cost. In the U.S. anyway, an awful lot of attention is focused on the cost of prescription drugs. We see and hear talk that the drugs are much cheaper in Canada, and there's constantly programs to try and get, especially our senior citizens, access to those lower cost drugs. The implication, frankly, is that drug companies are overcharging consumers. But the facts may be different. How do you respond to this perception that drugs are wildly overpriced?
Right. It's basically because the perception of why drugs are overpriced is because the manufacturing costs of drugs as compared to the selling price is somewhere in the 15 to 25% range. So people think, these companies have a gross margin somewhere in the 85 to 75% range. But we are probably the single largest spender of research dollars as a percentage of our sales, in the region of about 20% to discover new products. So by the time you factor in the cost of research and development, as well as the marketing, what we call marketing costs, bringing information to the medical profession, our margins are much smaller than perceived to be on a sales price versus a manufacturing cost basis. Drugs, if you look at it in Europe versus America, because a lot of studies have shown that America is more expensive than in Europe, we are today trying to introduce on a uniform price across the world, especially within the developed world, because we feel, otherwise it leads to distortions of parallel trade between countries. In Canada and in Europe, the government is the single largest payer of our drugs. So they fix the price of reimbursement. The US is a free market system, so we try to fix it based on an adequate return on our invested capital. But even in the reimbursed countries such as Canada and in Europe, we're trying to adjust our prices to be the same as in the US, so there is no distortions in the pricing system.
What people actually see going out of their wallet when they pay for healthcare expenses, they'll go to the counter of their local pharmacy, and after a copay, there are dollars that come out to buy their drugs. When they go to a hospital for a service, they may not necessarily see that dollar go out. Do you look at that overall healthcare dollar and try and educate a consumer about where that dollar, how that's broken up.
Yeah, and I think probably the pharmaceutical industry needs to do a much better job in educating the consuming public on the role of pharmaceuticals in the public healthcare system. And you very rightly point out, Jeff, if you look at that healthcare dollar, the pharmaceutical segment of that is probably 15%. And that's the segment that's most visible, because when you go to the pharmacy to buy your drugs, you get the sticker shock of the price of those drugs. But when you go for a minor procedure, say to a hospital or a nursing home, a lot of that is not visible to the patient who is paying for the cost, because it's directly between the nursing home and the insurance company. So there is that sticker shock of having to pay money out of your pocket for drugs, and the perception that drugs are extremely expensive. Now, I said of that healthcare dollar, 15% is just the cost of drugs. The rest is the other portion that goes to pay the medical profession, the doctors, the nurses, the hospitals, and a very large percentage of that healthcare dollar goes into the administration costs, which you're very well aware of. And I think if people are saying we have a system that's broke, we need to look at the different segments of the healthcare dollar where resources need to be adequately funded, and where waste has to be squeezed out of the system if we're going to make sure that that healthcare dollar is wisely spent.
We've seen some very high-profile medical liability cases turning on prescription drugs that had at one time been approved for use, that upon further study have found to be some risk associated with them, and they've been pulled from the market. How do you manage this risk so that you satisfy the demands of your company, but also your consumer that's just looking to these drugs?
Right. We try to do our best, but as you know, when you develop a drug, you're studying it in populations of 2,000, 5,000 patients. So it's a small sample when compared to the millions who take it once the drug is available on the marketplace. So in our lead up to developing a drug, we do all kinds of safety studies, acute toxicity, which is short-term effects, chronic toxicity over a longer period of time, and also other studies in terms of over generations, obviously using rodents to see whether there are any toxic effects. But once we've done all that, we find it safe, we provide it to the FDA, the regulating authority, and with the data we have, we probably see enough safety. Now, there's no question in my mind, every drug has some side effects. So once we've launched the product, we've got to be very, very vigilant in watching whether any adverse drug effects are being surfaced up. And doctors need to report it back to us, and we report it to the regulating authority. So we're very vigilant in watching that. Obviously, in the case of Vioxx, it was a much more widespread effect and hurt Merck tremendously. Not only had they to withdraw the product, but it hurt their image publicly. Now, that's one aspect of drug safety. But I'd like to point out, now there's been a swing of the pendulum to the other side. Everybody's worried about safety, so what it's going to do is create, again, a delay in the approval of new drugs, because the FDA has got very gun-shy because of the Vioxx scandal. What I'd also like to point out, that's the visible cost of drug safety. What is invisible is if we delay new drugs coming on the market, there are going to be a lot of lives that are lost because these drugs are not available, and that's not visible. So I think when we look at that whole equation of drug safety, we've got to make sure, while I'm totally for having safe and efficacious drugs on the market, we've got to make sure that the pendulum doesn't swing to the other side and we start delaying the approval for new drugs, because we become very strongly risk averse.
A controversial law in this country passed a little more than a decade ago, recently was a subject of a study, and this is to have pharmaceutical companies fund partially the operations of the FDA in return for the FDA, getting us into increased resources, approving drugs more quickly. And I believe the findings of the study found that this indeed worked, that fears of conflict of interest were unfounded, and that drugs were introduced to the market quicker than they might otherwise have been. How would you come down on whether the law should be renewed, and perhaps should it be tweaked a little bit? And if so, talk about that.
I can talk from personal experience, because When I was running Janssen in the U.S. in the mid-'80s, it was well known that drugs were approved earlier in Europe than they were in the United States, and it was known as the drug lag in the U.S. So people got very good, efficacious drugs for treating cancer, etc., later in the U.S. than in Europe. Now, what happened was there was a lack of resources to deal with the approval process in the FDA. So it's precisely that law that you talked about in 1992, that drug companies had to fund the increase of resources in the FDA, which then manifested itself through a more speedier approval process. And today, that whole situation of the mid-'80s has changed in that drugs are available faster in the US market than in Europe. And I think that's been to the benefit of the public, because you're aware of the fact that as we bring efficacious drugs, especially in hard-to-cure diseases like cancer, we save a lot of lives, or we extend the quality of life. Now, that's an important aspect. Now, we've got to be careful that if, because of the Vioxx case, we're going to become risk-averse and we're going to delay the approval of new drugs because there could be a potential conflict of interest, I think that would be the wrong decision. I think while the industry funds the FDA for the additional resources, the FDA still has to perform its function in the interest of the public, in terms of making sure there's efficacy of the product, there's safety of the product, and in partnership with the pharmaceutical companies, ensure that the best available medication is available for the consuming public.
You've talked a little bit about the opportunities afforded in India to increase manufacturing, increase testing, but also some of the problems. Have you seen your initial talk about this? You said that there's a concern about intellectual property issues, transparency in transactions. Have you seen any change over the last couple of years in India to make this a more effective way to practice manufacture of drugs?
Let me go back to how R&D costs have escalated in the industry. I'll just give you the kinds of numbers. Back in the 70s, the average cost of a new drug was somewhere between $50 and $100 million. Today, they're talking about over $1 billion. That's not sustainable, because you can't have a few years of research, not find a new product, because that's what's causing companies to dry up and consolidate to take costs out of the system, as opposed to bring new products. So what are companies doing? They're trying to reduce the costs of research, bring down the cost of a new drug from $1 billion. So they see if it's cheaper to do certain studies in India, certain functions of R&D in India, etc., etc. The typical outsourcing model that's going on in information technology. But India has not been a true follower of the patent system, and as you know, even though they've signed the WTO requirement to introduce patent systems into India, there is still a lot of leakage. Knowledge rests on two legs, and it can walk out of your door and go next door. And the enforcement of intellectual property is somewhat weak in India. So we do outsource a lot of our work in R&D into India, but we're careful in ensuring that some of it might be work that is less intellectually sensitive in terms of property, and that we would outsource to India. But the very, very sensitive intellectual property research, we tend to keep it within Western Europe and the US.
So much of the debate in this country, anyway, about healthcare has to do with healthcare is broken. And I think two of the areas that are most often brought up as being the most broke is the cost of healthcare keeps going up, and companies certainly are squeezed by that. And then there are people who aren't covered, and that percentage of the population keeps going up as well, and that's probably related to cost. If you had an opportunity to sit down with policymakers to think about this issue, what might you bring to the table?
Well, yeah, and I think it's a great question, because if you compare healthcare costs as a percentage of gross national product, gross domestic product, in Europe it runs at about 8 to 9% of gross national product, and in the US it runs somewhere in the region of 13-14%. And then you look at two outcomes. One outcome is morbidity. The second outcome is mortality and longevity. And there's very little differences. So obviously, there's something happening, assuming the healthcare dollar is defined the same way in Europe as in the US. Now, assuming it is, then the first thing is to see why these points of differences are arising, and if without any difference in outcomes in terms of morbidity and mortality. The second thing is to look within the healthcare dollar, as we spoke about earlier on, and see which are the different elements that compose the healthcare dollar. And as I said, we know in the pharmaceutical segment, we account for 15%. Sure, when products are out of patent, you bring in generic substitution to reduce the cost of healthcare in the pharmaceutical segment. But there is still the other 85% of which we talked about, a very large percentage in administration, a very large percent in medical fees, and a very large percent in insurance, because the high level of medical fees is related to the high insurance costs because of liability. So once you take all those different elements into account, I think we have to see which are the portions which one might describe as potential waste and potential areas for saving, and go after them so that one can arrest this increase of healthcare spending and make it much more affordable to the companies that have to provide that coverage for their employees.
Yeah. Is a single-payer system a viable alternative? It is in some countries, but there's been some criticism that it may limit access to health care, may limit innovation in bringing new products to market.
I'm not a great believer of the single-payer system, because you've seen that a lot of the hospitals in the UK, if you want to have a simple surgery, you've got to wait 8 months, kidney replacement a year, and so on and so forth. What I do believe is, like the US, a more open system, but provided it's run much more efficiently. And I do believe there should be coverage for the underprivileged portions of the population, so that everybody has some kind of universal healthcare coverage, at least the basic healthcare aspects. But I do believe an open system provides more choice for different segments of the population. And today, everybody under the single-payer system has to pay, and it's big brother or big sister who decides for you, as opposed to you deciding for yourself. So therefore, I like universal coverage, but a much more open system as in the US market.
Let me ask you to kind of peek over the horizon a little bit. What are some of the promising new areas of research or fundamental scientific discoveries, and how might they affect our health care?
I think Janssen, I might say, Dr. Janssen was one of the most prolific pharmaceutical researchers that ever lived in the world. And he developed drugs in different areas. Like if you look at that whole area of treatment of schizophrenia, haloperidol, Risperdal, there were breakthroughs. The treatment of pain in anesthesia and for analgesia, the fentanyl series, was developed by him. And as Professor James Black once said, the reason he did not win the Nobel Prize was he had too many discoveries, and it couldn't be described adequately in one line. Funnily enough, we just gave the Janssen Research Medal to Craig Mello, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. He has made an incredible discovery in RNA interference, in how to switch on and switch off certain disease-carrying genes. So that is an area of fundamental science which could have a major impact on drug discovery. But where are the areas where people are working on today? They're working on a lot of it in age-related diseases, and also in more developed economy, those kinds of disease. So age-related diseases are obviously cancer. If you look at it, we've made great strides in breast cancer, but we still have a lot of work to do in prostate cancer, in pancreatic cancer, intestinal cancer, but we're making progress all the time. We don't hear of big breakthroughs, but they're incremental improvements. We are looking at that whole area of dementia, what's also known as Alzheimer's, and trying to improve the quality of life and the treatment of the progression of that disease. If you look at as countries get more developed, the whole area of diabetes is becoming more and more an area. And then obviously we're looking at another way of approaching some of these diseases. AIDS, even though we don't think of it traditionally as a developed country disease, because the whole globe is becoming like a single village. There's a lot of transmission across the globe. So we're doing a lot of work in the area of AIDS. That's an area where still there's AIDS was almost considered a death sentence 10 years ago. Today, the industry is working to transform it into a chronic disease as opposed to a death sentence, which is a great improvement, if you see what I mean. And other, diseases that affect the tropical countries, such as tuberculosis, malaria, which are beginning to raise their head again.
Let me change the subject area completely and ask you to kind of put on your advisor hat, if you will. And if you were talking to a prospective MBA student or someone who just started, what might you say to them based on your experience to help them really get the most that they can out of their MBA education?
Sure. Apart from all the the core courses, one of the things I think is certainly important going out to the world is I know there were technology courses offered. I mean, try to have an understanding of what technologies are coming out in this world, whether it's in the healthcare sector or other sectors. So, the management of technology, especially in our industry, is becoming extremely important. As we talk about new products, it's not only our own research, but the ability to recognize good science outside and to develop collaborative partnerships. So in the second area I would talk about is the whole area which is a little bit of law, and a little bit of business development. How do you develop collaborative working relationships, business relationships across the globe? A third element would be the international dimension, whether it's international marketing or the whole international economics is an important area because, as you said earlier on, the globe is becoming a village. So, today you might sell in the US, you might make it in China, and you might have a logistics center somewhere in Europe. So the international dimension of business, there are very few companies who really are remaining within one single country, localized. As companies get bigger, the first thing they start doing is looking over their borders as to how to expand their markets. So the international aspect I would also strongly emphasize. But of course, all the core programs of finance, operations, marketing are all sort of like the foundation on which you build your business acumen on.
Given your 30 plus years in business, if you could go back and change anything, would you?
Probably not. I think the Tepper School has given me a great background on which to build on. It's only the starting point, but it's the place where you can get started off the blocks, and thereafter you've got to keep learning in your business experience around the world. And as somebody said, you have 1 month and 2 years, so you've got to listen a little bit more than you speak. But Tepper is a great place to build a foundation on.
Thank you very much, Ajit.
Thank you.
Much enjoyed speaking with you today.